So hello and welcome to this NPTEL session where we're doing this course in Feminist Writings, and I'm delighted to have a speaker today in this very special session, Dr. Michael Yates from Rikyo University in Japan. So Dr. Yates is a narratologist. That's his special area of research, and he works in narratology, post-classical narratology, coming from a postmodern tradition. And today we're in for a treat because he's going to talk about Angela Carter. And the title of the talk today is Fairytales, Sexuality, and the Deconstruction of Myth, which is very, very germane to the content of this particular course. I'm sure you can imagine that. So we'll make it very interactive. So you'll deliver a talk at the beginning, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end, where you're very encouraged to speak, ask questions, comment, and if you have any more perspectives that you can lend into this talk, you're very welcome to do it. So without any further ado, I request Dr. Yates to kindly begin his talk.
Thank you, Professor Pradui. So it's a pleasure being here. I don't think I expressed it enough in my session last week, how honored I am to be here and how thankful for your invitation to come here to IIT Madras and meet these excellent students, and the faculty here have been very kind to me. So first off, a message of thanks to everyone for inviting me here. Today's talk is, as Professor Pardui brought up, about Angela Carter. Angela Carter is somebody who I've been working on for several years, and who I'm really excited to talk about because I think she allows us to look at narrative in some really interesting ways and discuss the deconstruction and the structure of myth in interesting ways, because she oftentimes lays her cards on the table and shows us exactly what she's doing. And so that's where I wanted to start out with today's session. Okay, there we go. So in today's session, we'll be looking at three stories and also a little bit of theory. So one little point, as you can see here from the PowerPoint, I've changed it from Little Red Riding Hood to Cinderella, I think to be more in keeping with the topic that we're going to discuss. So we'll first look at Ashpattle, or The Mother's Ghost, which is a posthumously published work. Then we'll look at Angela Carter's translation of Perrault's Cinderella. And then finally, we'll look at Wolf Alice, which is from Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. So hopefully you had a chance to read or to look at Ashpattle. Ashpattle, the Carter version, is one of my favorite of her short stories because it has a very interesting sort of three-part structure where she seems to be mulling over the concept of the story and thinking about the plot, thinking about the characters, and also showing her hand again as the narrator, as the kind of a kind of a fairy godmother sense of authorship here. And so it comes to us, the reader, in three parts. So we first get a section called The Mutilated Girls, then we get a second section slightly shorter, The Burned Child, and then the third section, even shorter, The Traveling Ghost. So it's a kind of distillation of the Cinderella sort of origin, but it's also showing Cinderella as a myth going into her hands, so into this contemporary storytelling context. So it's an interesting structure. Of course, the structure of Ashpattle goes back to the German tradition of Cinderella. And she's taking, I think, her version from the Grimms, who first published their Ashpattle in 1812, I believe. And so these are some of the illustrations that have gone together with the Grimm's brothers' tales. So the first one we have here is Gustave Doré and his Cinderella. And the reason why I brought these slides today is to show the kind of different arrangements that we get with Cinderella. There are some very social arrangements, such as the French versions, and kind of a much more oral style of storytelling that we get in the Grimms, which is far more kind of in the backwoods forest sort of traditional sense of the telling. So those both have a contribution to the Cinderella myth, and that's why I wanted to show you these slides. As you can see with the Doré slide, we have Cinderella as the center here, but she's surrounded by these adoring men who obviously have some power to wield, right? So there is a power dynamic between the central protagonist, this young lady, and the court that is suddenly sort of devouring her at the end. Whereas in Edmond Dulac's painting of Cinderella, some maybe 15 years or 50 years later, there's a kind of quiet desperation to her circumstance, right? A very different approach to her as a character, right? She's depicted very alone here in the hearth, among the cinders, among the ashes, right? Lending itself to the title Ashputtel, right? So little ash girl would be one reading of that. So let's have a look at the first part of Carter's Ashputtel. We begin with the Mutilated Girls, and this is how she starts her analysis. And the first part of this three-part story is very much an analytical approach to the bits and pieces that construct this story, right? So we can hear Carter's voice, her authorial voice, coming through here as she mulls over the parts that have been put together by authors such as Perrault, such as the Grimms. So we get this first section here, and it reads, "But although you could easily take the story away from Ashputtel and center it on the mutilated sisters indeed, it would be easy to think of it as a story about cutting bits off women so that they will fit in. Some sort of circumcision-like ritual chop. Nevertheless, the story always begins not with Ashputtel or her stepsisters, but with Ashputtel's mother, as though it is really always the story of her mother, even if at the beginning of the story, the mother herself is just about to exit the narrative because she's at death's door. A rich man's wife fell sick, and feeling that her end was near, she called her only daughter to her bedside. ... Right? So here we get Carter exploring how this story gets rolling, right? It's a story of mutilation, of course, right? As you know from the original Grimm story, the mother, the stepmother, in order to get the shoe to fit, first she chops off the toes of the elder daughter, but a little bird comes and tells the prince, look in the shoe, there's blood in the shoe. And so he takes it off and, ooh, that's disgusting. So he takes her back, right? And then, of course, the second daughter gives it a try. So the mother can't get the shoe to fit, so she chops off the heel of the foot and shoves it back into the bloody shoe. I don't think there was any cleaning being done. And shoves it into the bloody shoe, and again the bird comes and says, look in the shoe, there's blood in the shoe. And he looks, and indeed there is blood. And he goes back for the third time, and it's Cinderella's chance to try out the shoe. And again, it's this nasty, bloody orifice that Cinderella is being asked to put her foot into, her lovely, dainty foot into. And Carter doesn't shy away from that bloody detail. Right? Very much this first section is about mutilation and the kind of expectation that goes into that kind of mutilation. Right? This is a mutilation that is being caused by her mother, right? It's also being caused by her society, her culture. All of these influences are coming in on these sisters and causing this mutilation. And of course, the third mutilation being Cinderella's actually acceptance of this horrible, nasty ritual and her being sent off to somebody who would ask a girl to put her foot into a bloody shoe. Right? So the third and final quiet and acceptable mutilation. Then we go into the second section, the burned child. Not quite as graphic in its violence, but nearing the first section. Here there's a focus on the burning aspect, right? The fact that this character has been sort of sent off to stay among the ashes in the oven, right? So very much a kitchen maid, a scullery maid. So we have here the first part of the second section. A burned child lived in the ashes. No, not really burned, more charred, a little bit charred, like a stick half burned and picked off the fire. She looked like charcoal and ashes, because she lived in the ashes since her mother died, and the hot ashes burned her so she was scabbed and scarred. The burning child lived on the hearth, covered in ashes, as if she were still mourning. Right. So of course, the sense of ashes and Christianity coming in here very symbolically at the end, but the sense that she is a leftover bit of refuse fallen on the kitchen floor is what Carter is emphasizing here. The sense of being discarded, having been somehow fallen off of the table, right? The clean table where everyone can have a happy family meal. She has somehow fallen under the table and been left behind. And that's very much a major theme in the Cinderella round or cycle. Okay, let's get to the third section. So in the final section of this story, the traveling ghosts, we have a further distillation of these sort of central elements. Right? And in the Ashpatel story, there's of course a hazel tree. Right? If you know the story, the father goes away traveling and he asks his daughters, "What would you like me to bring you?" And the first daughter says, "I want a silk dress." The second daughter says, "I want a string of pearls." But in her humbleness and her purity, Cinderella or Ashpatel asks for the first branch that brushes against your hat as you return. And of course, he's true to his word, this father, and he brings back a hazel twig, and Ashpatel plants it in the ground. And the hazel twig is nurtured by her tears and grows into a hazel tree. And this is important because whenever we see the name of the tree, it's not there accidentally, right? In any kind of mythology, the nomenclature of the tree or of these magical elements are essential. And hazel in the Druidic tradition is a very auspicious tree, right? Of course, the hazel creates the hazelnut, and the hazelnut in Druidic tradition, in Celtic tradition, is a kind of magic token of wisdom and power. It's a kind of talisman. And if you feed these hazelnuts to a salmon and then eat the salmon, then you become all powerful. It's kind of a Faustian myth. And if you know anything about Irish mythology, Finn McCool got his heroic power by popping the blister on a salmon as it was being cooked full of hazelnuts. And as he licked his thumb, all of the power from the hazelnut went into him and he became a hero. So the hazel tree is what is being referenced here in this third section. Right? She plants the hazel branch, it turns into a hazel tree, and a little bird comes up, and of course it's the same bird. It's her dead mother's ghost. And the dead mother's ghost gives her various special items, right? This is very much a helper kind of motif that's coming in here with the mother. But she's helping from beyond the grave. There's this very strong chthonic force in this dead mother who's coming back from the dead, coming back from beyond and bringing gifts to her daughter. So here is kind of the last section of that final part. The dead woman waited until night came. Then she climbed out of her grave, we assume, and went to the house. The stepmother slept on a feather bed, but the burned child slept on the hearth among the ashes. When the dead woman kissed her, the scars vanished. The girl woke up. The dead woman gave her a red dress, right, and so on. So as this sort of zombie mom comes from the dead, she first gives her a dress, and then she plucks the worms from her eyes and they turn into jewels. And she puts on a diamond ring. And then finally, this zombie mother asks her daughter to step into my coffin, she says. Step into my coffin. I did it when I was a girl. Right? And so even though Ashpatel doesn't want to do it, she very kind of gingerly steps into the coffin, and it turns into a carriage with horses ready to tramp away into the future. And the story ends, go and seek your fortune, darling. Right? But it's interesting the symbols that Carter uses here. Right? The worms from her eyes are akin to diamond rings. Right? There's a metaphorical connection there. Right? The transformation can easily return. Right? These diamonds and gems can easily turn back into worms, right? As we've seen in some other mythology. Likewise, this carriage that is carrying her off into her royal future, we presume, is a coffin. Right? It's also sealing her death. It's a death warrant. Right? And the red dress, of course, is laden with heavy symbolism. Right? It's the red of blood, it's the red of menstruation, it's the red of virginity and the loss of virginity. It's also the red of death. It's the red of being murdered. Right? So it's a heavy sexual and violent metaphor that she's stepping into. And this ironic ending, go and seek your fortune, right, is just laden with potential disaster. And that's how Carter is exploring this myth, right? She's exploring it in all of its gruesome details, but also in its very earthy delights, right? Carter revels in her language, revels in these symbols of darkness and taboo. And as she does that, she makes us think about the symbolism in this story, right? Her story is not the Grimm's story, right? And if you know anything about Grimm's fairy tales, from the 1812 version to the 1857 version, there are several editions, and they get cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and more Christian and more sort of Disneyfied as they go along. All of these sort of dark symbols, all these little moments of violence have been sort of brushed aside or have been sort of bowdlerized to be sort of digestible to all ages and all persuasions. But Carter is doing the opposite. She's reversing that trend of sort of cleansing and trying to make things dirty again, to get back to the core. So in the next section, we'll look at a little bit of theory. So we'll look at a little mythological theory, a logical theory, and some semiology as well. Start by having a glance at Christina Bachlega, who's a professor at the University of Hawaii. And one of my favorite of her works is this, the postmodern fairy tales. I think she does a really interesting job of deconstructing what authors such as Carter have done. Next, we'll have a brief look at Jack Zipes and think a little bit about the utopian impulse that's at the core of all kinds of fairy tale and mythology. And then we'll have a brief look at Barthes's Myth Today, which I think I see a few of you have from his mythologies, which gives us an interesting kind of template for structuring and considering the way that myths are put together. So let's begin with this famous diagram. I'm sure you've probably all seen this. But I think this is an interesting diagram for what we're looking at today, because it not only shows how language is built on, or myth is built upon language, but it also signals to us that it's not in any way a directed process. And any one of these categories can be emphasized in any given myth. Right? ideally, in a sort of typical fairy tale situation, we have the myth sort of developing out of the language, sort of sourcing the language and enriching the language, taking something like the apple from Snow White and turning that into a symbol, right? Giving it poison, giving it potent, right? Connecting it to the culture from which it evolves, right? Taking it from the Bible, taking it from other sort of cultural and social mythical contexts, and building a myth out of that material. But what we get here with Carter, as I mentioned before, is a kind of a return from this mythical meta-language, this meta-discourse, back towards the root of the language. There's always a gesture in Carter, I believe, of going back towards the signifier, going back to what is actually being used as language here. And she's very careful with her word choice. Right? And as you know in English, we often have two choices with any given noun because we've had so many influences. Right? For example, pig and swine. Right? They both describe the same thing, but one is Anglo-Saxon and one comes from a more romantic tradition. It comes from maybe old French. But they have a different sense. They have a different flavor in the mouth, right? The way that they're said, right? The pork is a very sort of Anglo-Saxon, heavy sort of Viking word, right? But swine has this very French fluidity, a kind of velvety roll to it. And Carter plays with that back and forth, right? Certain of her tales are very velvety. She uses a lot of sort of Francophile terms, a lot of allusions to French art, French history, French design, French food and cuisine and smells. She uses a very Frankish language, whereas other tales such as especially Wolf Alice, as we'll see, are very much a Northern European kind of Germanic language that she's using, very hard, cold words. So she's very aware of the language, right? So her meta-discourse is constantly looking back, looking over her shoulder at the language that is being employed in these. And so when she came to Perrault's translations, she was very aware, I think she became very aware of the language that he was using, because of the stylists of the fairy tale during Perrault's time, he was perhaps the most comfortable with the language. He was very much a poet of the fairy tale at a time when there were some excellent writers. So as Carter got into the fairy tale process through Perrault, I think it really tuned her ear to the language that was being used. So, at the root though, and this is something that is important to remember, that we're not just talking about language, but that we're talking about ideology, right? Hidden within this language, hidden within this meta-discourse and this discourse is always some sort of ideological program, right? And theorists such as Mircea Eliade have described it as the kind of camouflaged ideological content that's always at the core of any fairy tale, right? And it's the critic's job to kind of peel back the beautiful language and find the core that's camouflaged by the meta-discourse, the myth itself. So let's have a look at this. The ideological structures in fairy tales are always threatened by subversion due to the fact that they are, to a significant degree, predicated upon 1, the transformative and or subversive opposition to some type of or set of socio-political paradigms. For example, arbitrary tyranny, matriarchal hierarchy, pagan cosmology. And 2, the simultaneous installation and or affirmation of another type or set. Right? So a replacement of arbitrary tyranny with democratic government, or a replacement of matriarchal hierarchy with patriarchal hierarchy. And likewise, a replacement of pagan cosmology with Christian cosmology, etc., etc. Right? So these structures are always at risk. We can always take a fairy tale and restructure it, change the symbols, tinker with them, turn black to white, white to black, right? Add a strong mother instead of a strong father, right? So these ideological structures are weaker than they look, right? And Carter is very delicate with her approach to this, though she doesn't need to be. Let's hear from Christina Bachlega. Christina Bachlega says, as folk and fairy tale, the tale of magic produces wonder precisely through its seductively concealed exploitation of the conflict between its normative function, which capitalizes on the comforts of consensus, and its subversive wonder, which magnifies the powers of transformation. Right. So as we read a story, as we read Cinderella, there's a normative process going on. Right? Certain things are being shown as normal. Right? It's normal for a girl to want to better herself. It's normal for stepmothers to be nasty to their non-biological daughters. It's normal for a girl to marry a boy. It's normal for etc., etc., right? There's a normative process going on that's very, very digestible for young children, right? Because it's a kind of situation that maybe they can relate to. Maybe this is like them. They feel little. They feel alone. They feel neglected. They feel like there's something more, right? They're poor. They feel like they're wearing rags, but they want to have that dress in the window, right? And once you're a teenager, maybe you start to have romance and you think, maybe marriage is the only option, right? And this story tells you, yes, heterosexual marriage is your only choice, right? It makes that very normal and regular and modern common sense. But you can always change the polarities of any kind of story, right? So there's always this subversive wonder that is there at the core, right? And you're always subverting something, right? It's always at risk of being subverted, right? As we've seen in some recent Disney films, it's still a hot topic, and it's still something that can be augmented and changed. Okay, now we move on to Zipes, Jack Zipes. In his critical analysis of the stories of the Grimm brothers, Jack Zipes writes the following: each innovative telling or retelling and rewriting of a well-known tale in the cultural heritage is an independent human act seeking to align itself with the original utopian impulse of the first told tale. Right? So ideally, any fairy tale is trying to give you something to better you, to make you stronger, to make you smarter, to prepare you for the world, right? This has gone back for generations and generations, right? The stories that we have now have roots, back millennia. But there was always a progressive utopian core, according to Zipes. Right? The core of the story was always betterment. Right? The storyteller was telling you a story to make you laugh, or to make you afraid, to help you, to show you what is poisonous, the dangerous animals in the forest, right? The things to beware of, the things to look for, where you can get help. Right? Hazelnuts will make you strong and smart, for example. So there's no mistake to the kind of symbolism that comes into this, and it goes back to the earliest sort of stories that were told around the fire to improve that social unit, to improve that social round by telling them of the risks and the dangers of the world, and also to strengthen the sort of social bonds of that community by creating norms, right, through the normative language of this tale. Right. So Zipes goes on, the contemporary myth is not only an ideological message, but also a fairy tale that cannot totally abandon its ancient utopian origins. Right? So it never gets away from that utopian content, according to Zipes. We're always trying to better ourselves. Okay. However, Roland Barthes is a little bit more reticent about what the myth is doing. Right? He says, during the myth-making process, society, culture, ideology, and history are stolen and replaced by a simulacrum, or reflection of the natural world. Right? That's where we get that second-order discourse, the meta-discourse. Right? Myth coming out of language, sort of stepping above language and saying, I know better than you. Right? Because it is being replaced. We're now in the mythic realm. It's a simulated artificial realm, right, which pretends to reflect language, or reflect nature, but it's really only reflecting the language that it comes out of. Right? And Jacques Zipes, in reference to this passage, states, myth is a collective representation that is socially determined and then inverted so as not to appear as a cultural artifact. Right? So we get this sort of distancing at the beginning of almost every tale, right? Which is the once upon a time, right? Which is a kind of discursive distancing that asks us to suspend our disbelief. Please, if you will, suspend your disbelief and believe this story to be true. Even though there are talking dogs and monkey kings, still, suspend your disbelief. Go along with me. Once upon a time. Right? So even in that act of once upon a timing, we get this sort of new world order, this fictional world that we're being brought into, which allows for those ideological messages to get in without you being aware of them. Right? It's a perfect way of disarming your audience, taking away their weapons of defense, and getting in your message. Right. So Barthes is a little bit wary of this process. He says, this reflection is inverted. Myth consists in overturning culture into nature, or at least the social, the cultural, the ideological, the historical, into the natural. What is nothing but a product of class division and its moral, cultural, and aesthetic consequences is stated, as being a matter of course. Under the effect of mythical inversion, the quite contingent foundations of the utterance become common sense, right reason, the norm, general opinion, in short, the doxa, which is the secular figure of the origin. Right? So, as we've discussed just a moment ago, right, these sort of power struggles that we see in fairy tales are shown as commonsensical situations, right? Where the hero, because the hero is blank, because the hero is powerful, strong, smart, something, because the hero has this trait, he must succeed, or she must succeed. Right? And because they've succeeded, we have this hierarchy of that quality, right? Our kings, our queens, our leaders, our authority figures must be smart, strong, powerful, intelligent, beautiful, right? So there's a kind of classist hierarchy being supported here according to Barthes, right? And he's very clever in his insertion of this class division aspect, because this is very much about more than just human traits, right? There is a classist, there is a kind of social process going on here in dividing the intelligent from the not intelligent, the beautiful from the not beautiful, right? The clever from the stupid, for example. And that's something that we need to, as critics, be careful of. Right, so back to the Cinderella round. I won't lead you through the story. You've seen it Even in robot movies where we have robots fighting each other, we can have robot Cinderella. Cinderella is perhaps the most common sort of plot copula that there is in the world. It is transnational, pretty much everything. It's a very ancient pattern. But I think what is worth noticing here today is Carter's moral versus Perrault's moral, because we can see a vast difference in the kind of approach to the morality of the tales. So I want to focus in on that and have a look briefly at Arthur Rackham's illustration here from the 1919 version of Cinderella. And it's a reintroduction to the tale of this kind of darkness and dread that surrounds her. I think this would have been an illustration that Carter would have enjoyed immensely, because it has all these little creepy crawlies and sort of dark creatures surrounding her. So let's have a look at the morals. So a little history about Angela Carter's translation. Before she had translated Perrault, she had done some novels. She'd done a collection of stories. She'd won the Somerset Maugham Prize. But it wasn't until the mid-70s when she was offered the contract to do this translation that she really began her passion for the fairy tale and for mythology. And after her translation of this, in I think 1975, she continued to work within the genre, writing stories, collecting stories from around the world. And after she died in the early 90s, she had this immense posthumous volume of work that has been collected in several collections of fairy tales. So it really, her relationship to the fairy tale really began with this translation. But although she was very kind to Perrault, I'd say that would be the word. She was very close in her translation of his prose. She was a little more, let's say, artistic in her translation of his morals. So I want to look at the way that she has played with his moral a little bit. So here is the original moral translated into English from the 1697 version of Perrault's Cinderella. It reads in verse, "Woman's beauty is a treasure that we never cease to admire, but a sweet disposition exceeds all measure, and is more dear than a precious gem's fire. Now the fairy's gift to Cinderella, according to the story, was what she taught the girl about love and glory. And she did it so well that Cinderella became queen. Indeed, this story has a moral to be esteemed." Okay. So beauty being focused on here, right? Disposition, right? Even though he's sort of contradicting himself, he's listing off what a girl needs to have to be a success, right? You need beauty, you need a sweet disposition, perhaps some gems would come in handy. Let's see, love and glory come in, right? If you get that love, that romance, maybe it leads to glory. You can become a mother, a wife, maybe queen, right? So there's a suggestion and a sort of imposition of the doxa, right? As Barthes brought up, right? This common sense hierarchical knowledge that is being suggested here by Perrault. And he goes on in the last part, "Beautiful ladies, it's kindness more than dress that can win a man's heart with greater success. In short, if you want to be blessed, the real fairy gift is graciousness." So again, kindness and maybe fashion and a man's heart. These are all the important things. You need to get the man's heart. If you don't get the man's heart, you're a failure, right? And if you want to be blessed, then you have to be gracious, right? And gracious is a very tricky term, right? Because what is gracious? Is it being polite? Is it having good manners? Or is it always taking a step back, letting the man go first, letting the man eat first, letting somebody go before you, somehow lowering yourself? There's a kind of inherent obsequiousness in the word gracious, right? And it's placed at the end for a very powerful reason, right? It gives us the real gift, right? This second-hand quality is really what men are looking for. That's an interesting little final punctuation there. Next, with Carter, we get a bit more of kind of a old wives' slap in the face with her moral. Right? She's very down to earth. She's not messing around here. This is straight from her gut, and she's not trying to sell us any nonsense. It's very, very brusque. And she says, and it's not in verse, you'll notice, she writes, "It is certainly a great advantage to be intelligent, brave, well-born, sensible, and have other similar talents given only by heaven. But, however great may be your God-given store, they will never help you get on in the world unless you have either a godfather or a godmother to put them to work for you." So this is veiled language of get an education, right? Go to school, get smart, find somebody smart and be aware of their intelligence, right? And hopefully, if you're lucky enough, you'll have somebody watching over your spiritual growth, right? That's what a godmother or godfather is charged with, to maintain, at least in a Christian tradition, your reverence, your sense of spirituality. Make sure you go to church. But in a secular sense, your godmother or godfather is meant to look after you, right? Make sure you're on the right path, right? And that's, I think, what all educators are charged with as well, is to make sure our students are on the right path. So for Carter, being a very well-educated and sort of an educator herself, I think what we have here is a veiled signal to the reader, to the young girl or boy, make sure you go to school. So very different, as we can see in this comparison between Perrault and Carter. This is, of course, Carter's translation of Perrault, right? She's taking this, we assume, from Perrault's work. But she's definitely putting her hand into there and making some changes. Let's hear from Makinen, and this is one of my favorite critics of Carter. And she says, "Carter saw fairy tales as the oral literature of the poor, a literature that spanned Europe and one that encoded the dark and mysterious elements of the psyche. She argued that even though the 17th and 18th century aristocratic writers fixed these tales by writing them down and added moral tags to adapt them into parables of instruction for children, they could not erase the darkness and the magic of the content." Right? And I think we see that a little bit even in just that comparison of the morals. Right? It's very oral. The way that she approaches the moral is not in verse. It's not a writerly. It's very much an orally written piece of text there at the end. Right? She's coming to you as the fairy godmother, giving you that gift of knowledge at the end. She's not coming to you as a kind of parochial sort of schoolmaster, smacking your wrists with his cane. Right? She's coming to you as a friendly but kind of rough grandmother. And she's like a friendly but kind of rough and very mealy-mouthed grandmother. She doesn't attempt to erase the darkness and the magic, right? It's all about the darkness. It's all about the magic for Carter. And we see this especially in tales such as Wolf Alice, which is what I want to do next, is to discuss this tale. So briefly sketch out the outlines and then open it up to a general discussion of what we've talked about so far. But if you also want to reference this story and discuss this story, then we can use this time to do that. So to just generally summarize the story, we have two characters essentially. We have this wolf girl who seems to have been orphaned in the forest and raised by wolves, who eventually makes it through to the mansion of the Duke. And the Duke also has a kind of a backstory to him. He seems to have been birthed into the world with his teeth already sharp and intact, and he bites off his mother's nipple. So we get this sense of bloodlust or vampiric sort of zombie tendencies in the Duke. So we have this werewolf girl, this girl of the woods, very natural, very visceral, and we also have this Duke who is sort of this supernatural figure as well. Sort of they're both born in these bizarre worlds, and they somehow come together. And some critics have seen this story as a kind of Garden of Eden analogy, right? So we get this sense of this supernatural Adam and this dark and animalistic Eve coming together to join in some sort of union, right? There's a kind of mutual attraction, mutual sort of intrigue that develops throughout the story. And the rest of society sees them as monsters, right? She doesn't shy away from the language of describing him, the Duke, as a vampire, right? He eats corpses, he sucks their blood. Likewise, this wolf girl, like any wolf girl, she doesn't know how to use a toilet, she doesn't know about language, she scratches herself and runs around, and she sleeps on the floor and etc. So there's a darkness and a kind of grittiness to Carter's language here. But as they come together, there's an interesting romance that develops. And I think it's very unique for that very reason. So to avoid me speaking for the entire time, I want to open it up to discussion now. So if you have any comments about any of the topics that I've brought up today, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll discuss the story or any of these topics thus far.
If I could just set the ball rolling, and
Okay.
you were very generic then. I was thinking, you took us through the stories and the theory that goes into corpus narratives. I was struck by the viscerality in that kind of writing. So do you think that embodied quality is something she does deliberately as a part of the deconstruction package?
Right.
Viscerality.
I think so, because as these stories were written down, as these stories were developed, especially in Europe, during the Victorian period, they were cleaned up.
Yeah.
They were tidied up. All references to sexuality, all of the very sexual and violent aspects were turned into symbols at best or removed at worst. And she was aware of that, right? She'd done her research and realized that the really exciting tales are the ones that were before those removals and replacements occurred, right? So she's trying to get back to that kind of material, right? The material where these stories were really active in society, when they really had a purpose, not just for these very polite educational purposes with the moral and etc. She wanted to get back before that, back to their kind of dark origins. And you could only tell a tale if you could get your audience to be intrigued by its violence, by its very sexual content. And things were different 200 years ago, right? We were, at least in Europe, we were much freer to speak on these subjects than, especially during the 19th century. So she wants to predate the 19th at least, and maybe even go back before the 17th, right, before Perrault's time, to the roots of the oral tradition, when it wasn't so clean, when taboos were hit hard.
can we say that there's a sort of bidirectional nature to Carter's retelling of the stories? Because let's in a story like Wolf Alice, like she tries to reclaim the viscerality and the darkness which is inherent probably in the first like druidic versions of the stories, and at the same time in other stories she tries to undo the and deconstruct the morality layer which has been added onto it, so as to open up the process to further more retellings in a more modern context.
Yeah, definitely. There are both directions.
It's like reclaiming the past which was hidden behind, and as well as making it more modern.
I think so. Yeah, I think one way to read this collection is to read it as a novel, right? Which would give us both directions, right? Each of these stories helps us read the next story, right? So, for example, the first story is The Bloody Chamber, and it's very much a forward-looking retelling of Bluebeard, right? So we get a replacement of certain aspects. Instead of the brothers stabbing the monster at the end, we have the mother riding in, right, solo with a pistol, right? So what a cool mom, right? And she comes and shoots Bluebeard through the head, and right, and after Bluebeard dies, then they create a special music school for the blind, right? That has never been in the story before, right? So it's a very progressive, very politically aware story that is trying to create, again, a new utopia, right? These are the things that she wants to bring to the world, right? That she thinks might be possible, right? And the romance at the end of her version is not a romance of getting married. They're just living together, right? It's a very equanimical relationship that she has with her new boyfriend, right? They're shacking up. They're not getting married. There's no rings. There's no wedding. They're just living together in this music school for the blind, and all of their money goes into this. So there's this new ideology of economics, this new awareness of differently abled. There's this new relationship to heterosexuality and to marriage and to the church. Right? So she is replacing these things, and it's a progressive. But like you said, Wolf Alice is very much more backwards looking, right? It's trying to get into the past, right? It's not trying to produce a new future, but to see where our human relationships may have come from, right? Our sort of animal drives. She's trying to sort of scrabble back to the origins of sort of the animalistic in romance, right? So both of those tendencies, definitely. Thank you for your question.
I suppose just to continue with Mohit's observation, which is excellent, I think, in terms of looking at it from a wide direction perspective, the temporality of it, going past, going forward. It's a very interesting entanglement of the animal, as you say, and the machine. Right. The machine is forward moving, it's forward looking. At the same time, there's some sort of entanglement happening there, some kinship, which sort of problematizes the pure organic human order as well. So I think that hybrid between the animal and the machine is probably what signifies or is a metaphor of the bidirectionality that Moy talked about.
I think so. At least in this collection, there's an animatronic maid at one point, and the protagonist is being sort of likened to her, right? And there's this sense that female mores, right, the expectations of the girl, are like the expectations of a robot, right? They can be sort of socially programmed to do certain things, right? And that so much of our culture, so much of our education, so much of our symbology is very much a kind of social programming, especially for women, but also for boys, right? The whole pink and blue, robots for boys, butterflies for girls sort of dichotomy is something that Carter was obviously not comfortable with, and she wanted to problematize that. So the protagonist's interaction with that robot was very much kind of looking in the mirror and seeing herself as a robot, and wow, a sudden realization, kind of that satori moment of Zen where you see everything for its true face. And the realization that, no, I don't want to be a mannequin. I don't want to just be a pretty little thing for a prince.
Yeah.
That's very much part of her project.
Because I was thinking of Haraway's blurring of distinctions between first man and animal, and then organism and machine. And instead of actually happening in fiction and Carter's narratives.
Sure.
Right. So that's there's a cyborg quality.
Sure. At its best. Yeah, but the cyborg for Carter, I think, is always superhuman rather than subhuman.
Yeah.
Right? I think in this sense, the robot would be subhuman. But in another, especially in Haraway's context, it would be somehow superior to the human. You're both an algorithm, but you're also organic.
Yeah. There is hierarchy, yes.
Like the instance that you just described in this other story, it acts like a very perfect mirror to what happens in Wolf Alice when she looks herself in the mirror and then she slowly realizes herself to be a human and it to be a reflection of her rather than another creature. So, from animality to human condition as well as from as I said cyborg, that also like approach human nature.
Right. I think there was just a little touch of Lacanian theory that Carter just sort of suggests there, that now she's human, right? That there's this sort of border crossing. Right, the mirror state is achieved. Now she can go on and progress as a human. And I think we get that similarly at the end of the tale with the Duke, his sort of Dorian Gray in reverse sort of portrait is coming into shape, right? He suddenly has a shape as well. So there's that dual mirroring, right? She suddenly sees her image and he suddenly has an image, right? And both of those need to be in place for any kind of relationship to progress. So that's a good point.
This is slightly biographical, but what was Carter's relationship with our contemporary institutionalized feminism? Was she in bed with the French feminists, for instance? Or did she make a very deliberate departure as an artist rather than an ideologue?
No, she was very actively engaged with at least with the fictional side and fiction writing and artistic side of the feminist movement. Once she settled in London in, I think, about the same time this was published, about 1979, or 70, maybe been a little earlier. But she stayed in London for the remainder of her life and was engaged in magazines such as Bananas. And Bananas was a very feminist bent sort of creative writing magazine. And she often published there and was very active in the community, trying to help other female writers and poets publish their works. And very much an active critic of other female authors, and very much a proponent of a new kind of female sexuality, right? A female sexuality that wasn't always the one on the bottom, right? Wasn't the victim role, right? She was very much a Sadian in her philosophy. She wanted to see women take a kind of vicious role in their sexuality, and that sort of masochism and sadism to her wasn't necessarily a negative aspect of sexuality, right? That she wanted women to have an equal bent towards masochist and sadist tendencies, to sort of exercise that right as humans.
Right? So it's a very complex equation between violence and empowerment.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
She wasn't saying men need to be less violent. She was saying women need to be more violent, right? More sexual. That would be empowering to her. That it wasn't about making everyone calm down. She didn't believe in that. She didn't believe that was possible. We are animals, but after all. So to bring that animalistic sense back to femininity, I think was her sort of her goal.
So to pick up on that point, the animalistic quality, you have consecutive stories, the courtship of Mr. Lion and the Tiger's Bride, where in one there is the transformation from the animal to the human. The man transforms to the human, the lion transforms to a human, and then in Tiger's Bride, the woman is transformed into an animal, the tiger. So it's very fluid. The categories are like the boundaries can be crossed. That kind of thing. Yes, yes.
Right, that's a good point. Right.
And there are consecutive stories in the collection.
That's true. That's true. That's true. Yeah, when all of the hair melts away and we get this sort of Disney transformation at the end, I was a little bit disappointed in that. I still kind of hold that against her. It's too safe. I don't know. Maybe she just wasn't up to it that time. But yeah, I think there is some dynamism.
Discussing this yesterday in terms of looking at the superficiality of Shakespeare's endings. So do you think there's a bit of a double joke there? I mean, she gives you a closure which is safe and sanitized, but there is an embedded superficial quality to it, which is meant to convey they don't take this seriously. The real damage has happened already in the middle, so the closure is, the shallowness is quite palpable, right, as reader.
Yeah, well, I think she was very aware of her endings, especially in this, but in her novels as well. Endings, I think, for her were paramount. And she didn't ever, which is why I hold that ending against her, that kind of easy Beauty and the Beast kind of expected ending. I hold that against her because I don't see it in any way problematic. I don't see it in any way challenging the tradition. So I find it kind of a slip. But her endings tend to be very carefully considered, sometimes a bit heavy-handed, right? Like with the Bloody Chamber, we get this kind of final list of all the things that she wants in the world. And I find it a bit heavy, right? And really? Right? Really? That's how it ends? Like she's kind of piling it on, and also this, and this would be good, right? So she can be a bit much, but I do think that she's very careful about the suggestions at the end. And I think if we look at the endings specifically, if we only look at the endings of this collection, we'll find kind of an empowering and at least femininely empowering end to most of them, to the majority, where we have a kind of hungry sexuality at the end, especially among the female protagonists, right? Some of them even saying, "You're not going to eat me, I'm going to eat you." She puts that kind of perspective on things quite a lot in this collection.
I wanted to ask another question. Like, how would you compare the project of this deconstruction of fairy tales and this reclamation of feminine nature, which was explored, and which was explored in a much more visceral way in the earlier versions of fairy tales? So, how would you compare Carter's project, which she explored in these works, with the kind of change that has come in, let's say, Disney movies and their interpretation of these fairy tales, in which like more and more focus is now put on let's say female protagonist, and this gender roles and this normativity of heterosexual relationship is also being challenged. And like a very common example might be Shrek, in which she decides to stay as a monster at the end. So it's like an inversion of Beauty and the Beast. So DreamWorks.
That's really true.
Yeah. So like, how would you compare these two trends?
Well, I think we have two very different social roles being discussed here. Right? The role of a film is to make money and to benefit Disney or the producers, whether it's Pixar or Illustrate or Illumination, etc. So it's a business, but it's a social business, right? You have to make the customer happy. But I do think there's a social awareness among Disney films recently that is surprisingly hopeful. But I do think that the oral process of storytelling and the sort of public cinematic process of storytelling are very different things. Although Disney is trying to source that material, right? They're very careful to make it kind of oralistic. Right? They're using oral techniques to do their storytelling. It's very much based on fairy tale method. But it's for a very different purpose. So Disney's approach to the fairy tale is to, I believe, make the customer happy, right? And to be very sensitive to the zeitgeist and to what's happening in society, the Me Too movement, feminism, political correctness, gay rights, same-sex marriage. These issues are having a very major effect on the writers and illustrators and sort of administration of Disney, for sure, because that's, I think, in the corporate interests. But when it comes down to the fireside and telling your grandchildren a story, there's a very different relationship between the listener and the teller. And that's really what Carter's concern was to maintain that very oral, direct link of communication and message, conferral of the message between the older, wiser and the younger, naive. And that relationship was essential, especially for girls, right? That there wasn't a voice out there today doing that. There are all of these men talking to girls, right? These men putting on this sort of mask of the fairy godmother and putting on the fairy godmother's voice. Oh yes, I'm the fairy godmother and I'll tell you what you should do, little girl. But it's still a man, right? It's still a male writer inscribing these prescriptions of female behavior, right? So Carter wants to rip up that outfit, get him out of the way, and in place herself as very much a real fairy godmother figure, and do that for the betterment of her audience. So I think there's a very different process there. But it's, yeah, we need to be aware of the improvements that Disney has taken, and not fall victim to their own ideology, because there are some questionable bits to even the best of the new Disney, although they've made huge steps forward in the kind of sexist doxa that they're selling, in comparison to things such as Snow White, which was their first animated film, and then later Sleeping Beauty, very heavy-handed with their sort of heterosexual messages and social messages of hierarchy. I think we've gotten beyond that a bit, but it's taken a century to do so. Let's hope we can go further.
If you look at the Disney movies or the adaptations of fairy tales, you take the central plot and you play with it and you do things which are innovative and fit the contemporary way of storytelling. But Carter is the fairy tale in its true essence, I think. Like, when I was reading the first story and there's a mention of the telephone, so I was like, where's the telephone coming from? This is a fairy tale. You get so immersed in it, and all the things that you would roll your eyes at in a medieval version of it, she's done away with. Right. She's brought in her own, yes, they did have sex. It's not shied away from as in the medieval version. So right. I feel as if compared with the retellings, it's the fairy tale in its essence, but more suited. She does away with the rubbish, she does away with the pretenses, and she puts it out there. But it is the fairy tale. Yeah. It has the essence, it has the beauty, it has the immersive storytelling aspect. I agree.
And also, just to quickly add on to that, from a formalistic perspective, it has the Australian quality to it, right? The entire defamiliarization thing. You put a telephone in a medieval setting, and everything changes, dramatically.
But it's never entirely medieval, though, is it? It's kind of this otherworldly story world. Yeah, you can't really place it. you're not sure if it's 17th, 18th, maybe 19th century. Okay, if there's a telephone, then it must be what time in the 19th, right? It's constantly making you wonder when the time is. And I think she uses that to the benefit of the story, right? Because she really catches you in that mysterious sort of liminal space, which is somewhat real, but somewhat unreal, right? It's very dreamy. And she doesn't shy away from things like telephones and cars, right? They're part of our reality now, so why not have a car or a telephone, right? But she brings, it's still a magic car, it's still a magical telephone, right? There's always magic in that. But I think that's one thing that Disney would never do, right? If Moana is out there on her boat, she wouldn't just pull out the smartphone and check her emails, right? But I think Carter might. Right? If Carter was doing Moana, she'd have her on social media, for sure. But different situations. All right. Thank you for your comment.
So do you think that leads on to just probably the last couple of questions? Because I was intrigued by Carter's, again, it's a bit biographical, Carter's relationship with the postmodern magic realist writers, especially Rushdie. I sort of looked up to her as a mentor figure in some sense. So she was never deliberately magic realist in that sense. I think she would prefer the fabulous tradition or the fantastic tradition. So do you think there's any ontological difference between what we just talked about as having a telephone in a medieval setting and the Rushdian narrative of magic realism?
No, I don't think there should be any distinction. I think magic realism is a kind of fantasy, or vice versa, fantasy is a kind of magic realism. But I do, if I had a blackboard, I would sketch it out. But I do think there is a spectrum to myth, right? And it runs all the way to the esoteric religious, right? The holy text, the Quran, the Torah, the Bible, all the way back to the 0 point of experience, right? And as it goes through that, we get fairy tales, we get the folk tales, and it comes closer to the human experience, that sort of realist moment, which would be the 0 point. But that magic realism, fairy tale, folk tale, myth, such as Greek myth, the gods, and of course all of these religious traditions as we get towards the end of that spectrum, they're all represented on that mythical spectrum. So to make these distinctions between maybe science fiction and sort of oldie worldy Tolkien-esque sort of fantasy, I think is a mistake, because I think they share a lot. And if you read somebody like Joseph Campbell and start to think of the mythical cycle, you can really start to see that, I mean, figures such as Buddha and Christ, we're going through the same sort of things as Cinderella. Right? They both have, they're following the monomyth. They're following the monomythical pattern of the hero. And that's what really defines that mythical spectrum as one of the aspects of narrative literature, at least. Yeah, but it's a very hot topic, because if you go to a fantasy conference, for example, and you meet sci-fi people and you meet sort of Tolkien fans, they do not want to think of their genres as any way related. Right? These are not fairy tales. This is serious. And that always blows my mind, because they're not so different. I mean, how is the Marvel universe that different structurally than Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, for example, right? They both have supernatural creatures, etc., special powers, special weapons. It's just a different setting, different trees, maybe. Thank you very much.